Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to the organisers for the kind invitation to have me speak here. Alas, as has already been indicated, I'll be speaking in English. This is an added humiliation to being now an extra-communautaire, but there we are. Time marches on. One day, perhaps, we will reverse this particular movement of history. Now, industrial sovereignty has been a crucial issue for much of the world for most of our history, certainly in the 20th century. Yet, its moment seemingly has passed. We have entered, we are told, into an age of globalization and neoliberalism, when such ideas were, at least in public, not to be uttered. But of course, is returning with a vengeance now as a political issue. Industrial policy, sovereign capabilities are everywhere. At least in talk, reality is a different matter. Now, how are we to understand this? Not, I think, in terms of standard economic models, for the relations of theory and practice in this area are not obvious. Most theory around economics has been free trading and internationalist. Much practice was and remains autarkic and nationalist. We need to understand then, I think, practice independently of theory. Now, economists, of course, point to the costs of sovereignty, rightly. But in some cases, the issue is not costs at all, or how cost regimes change, because the world is not as economists hypothesize. In certain circumstances, in war and rearmament, states may have no choice but to be sovereign or try to be sovereign. Where there is price gouging, where there is control by others in other forms too, states may want to be sovereign. But there is another point, which is the costs of sovereignty argument may not be quite right. After all, the great period of search for national sovereignty, the years after 1945, or at least since the 1930s, have been productive of economic growth. The years from the 40s to the 70s were not, I think, just a period of increasing trade, but of increasing self-sufficiency. Now, that's not an argument for self-sufficiency. It simply could be the case that the same expansionist policies that produced growth also produced self-sufficiency. But it's worth thinking about the point that for Western Europe at least, the age of open global markets has been an age of low economic growth. One perhaps ought to sympathize, if not with free market Brexiters, at least nationalist lexiters on this particular point. Of course, in other places, we've had historically unprecedented rates of economic growth in the recent past, but they too, actually, are associated with the acquisition of capacities rather than getting rid of national capacities. It's striking that China is developing all sorts of new capacities, but it's also striking that China is probably less sovereign today than it was in the 1960s. If you like, it's no longer North Korea. It's something else. It's something integrated into global supply chains, which it does not control. Now, it's far too easy, I think, to see globalization in terms of trade, to see it extending and retreating in different periods. But the relations of trade and globalization are just part of the story. Michael Geyer and Charles Bright, in a brilliant and not sufficiently known article from more than a decade ago, distinguished very usefully between globalization and the condition of globality. In the condition of globality, everything is connected and everyone is vulnerable. Thus, there is a push to be powerful, to be self-sufficient, to be sovereign, precisely in the context of the condition of globality. And here globality does not mean the pieties of liberal economics, but a nationalist search for sovereignty, power, which requires relations and dependency sometimes on other powers. And here the search for sovereignty is often the driving principle of economic growth. Now, how are we to understand what sovereignty might mean in the context we're discussing? What does sovereignty over an industry or over a set of techniques look like? I want to suggest that we need to think about different levels and different scales of sovereignty. Let's think about levels. At the lowest level, there's the ability to use a technique. For example, running an airline, having airplanes and using them. Now, for some countries, this might involve foreign pilots, and for many more, foreign-trained pilots. And yet, having a national airline is clearly a very important symbol of sovereignty for many countries. Second might be the ability to maintain and repair aircraft, to take this example again. And many countries do not have that ability. Third would be the ability to make some parts of airplanes. China hosts an Airbus assembly facility and is now beginning to produce its own jets, but largely of imported parts, not least engines. To what is this new airplane Chinese or not? Fourth is the ability to make a whole airplane, which is in fact exceedingly rare, it turns out. And fifth, the ability to design new airplanes, rarer still. Now, where does sovereignty alight most importantly on those levels? Well, we have arguments about each of those levels, of course, arguments for sovereignty operating at each of those levels, but they are different. There's also the question of scales of sovereignty. What is the sovereign unit? To say the nation, I think, is not enough. The nations vary radically in size and economic power. And because sovereignty is not, in fact, necessarily usefully thought of in national terms or national territorial terms at all. In terms of the question of scale, one ought perhaps to compare Boeing and Airbus. Put another way, Uruguay will have different pretensions to sovereignty compared to France, but it may well be thinking along the same lines as, let us say, the city of Marseille. Now, if it's not national, what is it? Well, if we go to the 1930s, we see a great concern with the question of sovereignty over industry and over raw materials. How was the extent of control or sovereignty measured? Nearly universally, the question was asked, do we as a nation or empire have within our territory zinc or nickel or copper or whatever it might be? What share of the world's iron, let us say, do we control? Control of territory was the criterion. It was, it turned out, a foolish criterion, and one which, luckily, British liberals did not fall for. Thus, the United Kingdom went to war in 1939 with very little, in fact, essentially no national oil supply and very little imperial oil. And yet, it had control or potential control, or had a control by friends of the oil. So it was, in fact, massively oversupplied with oil. It could also acquire control, as it did in Iran in 1941, invading a non-imperial territory. The key point is that they could get oil from the world. They controlled transportation. Contrast this with the Japanese case, where the Japanese acquired one of the world's major oil fields in what had been the Dutch East Indies, and in fact directly controlled more oil production than the British did by 1942. It did them no good because they were unable to transport the oil to where they needed it. Similarly, had the Nazis conquered Baku intact in 1942, they would have had extreme difficulty in making use of that oil. In other words, control of trade, control of supply is critical, not where things happen to be geographically. Let me now turn to the case I particularly want to dwell on to illustrate some of these issues. And that is British and French civil aviation after 1945. Now, both the United Kingdom and France had great aeronautical traditions, obviously so. But by 1945, both had fallen behind the United States of America, to an extent, actually, which I think is not appreciated, certainly in Britain. I don't know about France. Both Britain and France had a very strong sense of the loss, to the United States in particular, of their scientific and technological patrimony. The United Kingdom felt itself to have been first in atomic energy, in jet engines, in penicillin, and much else. And it had given all these things to the world, and indeed felt that the world owed Britain something in return. France, too, could claim to be a pioneer in many areas, not least atomic physics and aviation. And interestingly, both nations developed the notion that they were exceptionally good at inventing and bad at developing and more generally commercializing. Sort of a cult of the brain rather than the muscle, if you like, which I think continues to this day. Now, after the war and until the very late 1950s, and in many ways later still, the United States had an extraordinary monopoly on the top end of civil aviation. One essentially could not cross the North Atlantic, key commercial route, without American airplanes until the late 1950s. The United States dominated actually with just 3 airplanes, each of them powered by one of 3 extremely powerful piston aero engines. All the European airlines that wanted to cross the Atlantic bought some of these airplanes, one of these 3 airplanes. Now, the British thought that the Americans had basically cheated. Their argument was that during the Second World War, they had agreed with the Americans that the Americans would build transport aircraft while the British built combat aircraft. So they gave, as they saw it, this lead to the United States. It wasn't true, although it's repeated in many of the history books. But the result was that the United Kingdom was exceptionally keen to develop aircraft for its airlines which could fly the Atlantic. There was huge nationalistic pride in British efforts. And they took 2 forms. One was to use low-powered engines, British engines, to create a small airliner that could cross the Atlantic. The second was to use jet engines to make massive airliners that would supposedly come into operation in the early 1950s. Huge, expensive projects using jets critically. However, it took until 1958 for a British jet to achieve a better performance than US piston-engined aircraft designed in the 1940s. Only in 1958 could a British airplane cross the Atlantic. It's as simple as that. However, by 1958, 1959, the Americans had much larger and much more successful jet aircraft, 3 of them, in fact. But the myth that Britain had pioneered the jet age when it came to civil aircraft with the Comet of the early 1950s was extremely powerful and endures to this day. Indeed, the argument is made that British failure with the Comet led to American success with the 707 some years later. Completely untrue, as it happens, but extremely powerful notion to this day. So the United Kingdom was unable to capitalize on its genuine lead in jet engines, which it's regarded as one of its great inventions. And here's a curiosity. The United Kingdom, in fact, had a powerful piston engine, which it didn't use, or hardly used at all. Why? Because it wanted to develop the jet engine. It even refused the possibility of putting those powerful British engines into a very successful US aircraft that could fly the Atlantic. Quite explicitly, because that would damage British national prestige. So they were preventing themselves from doing something very obvious. And they were later forced to take an American airframe and put a British engine in it, but this was acceptable because the manufacture of the airframe took place in Canada and not the United States. So there was an imperial dimension, which made it more acceptable. The result, by the way, was that the United Kingdom operated some very bad aircraft in the late 1940s and 1950s, which cost the British Airlines money. They, in effect, weakened the British aircraft industry. Aiming for national sovereignty, for national pride, did not result in national sovereignty, but weakened the national aeronautical effort. What about France? Now, the French accepted what the British did not want to, which is that the United States had the best engines. And it used them for early post-war airliners. I don't know how well known this is in the French case. Now, these airliners, the Armagnac and the Deux Ponts, weren't especially successful, but they did use American engines. And when it came to the jet age, France was actually more successful than the United Kingdom, believe it or not. The Caravelle, which you all know, beautiful aeroplane, sold much more successfully than the Comet. How was this possible? Well, part of the answer is that the Caravelle used British engines, later American engines. And indeed, the front end of the Caravelle was the same as the Comet. In other words, this is too crude, the British were massively hubristic about their place in the aeronautical world. They felt cheated, they felt they were really the best, whereas the French knew they needed to get better and knew their limits, and especially around engines, and thereby succeeded. And we can see here the extraordinary strength of the French industry essentially led to Airbus. And we have, in the case of the United Kingdom, a very strong Rolls-Royce, which succeeded in the end precisely as the industry should have succeeded in the 1940s didn't, by supplying engines not to British airframes but to American and European ones. Now, the aircraft industry is actually a very interesting case. It's proved extremely hard to acquire sovereignty of any kind in the aircraft industry. The Soviet industry could only exist in its own sphere. It utterly collapsed from the 1990s onwards. Extraordinary. This vast productive apparatus just disappeared. Japan has never broken in successfully to civil aviation, and China may perhaps now. May perhaps. So the whole world, as we know, flies Boeing or Airbus. Extraordinary, really. Now, we should be careful with this story. It's obviously the case that suboptimal aeroplanes may well serve other purposes, as they did in the case of the Soviet bloc. The British and French both developed and used inferior national airplanes, partly for good reasons. But the point is there's a choice to be made, a cost to be faced up to. The nuclear case would be another example. Both the United Kingdom and France claim national bragging rights when it comes to the nuclear. We're talking about the land of the Curies and the Rutherfords, after all. Now, neither, of course, were the first to build an atomic bomb or a nuclear pile, but both had important military and civil nuclear programs. Remarkably, the United Kingdom in the 1950s had the most ambitious nuclear generating program in the world. And unbelievable as it now seems, into the late 1960s produced more nuclear electricity than any country in the world, in absolute terms. More than the Soviet Union, more than the USA. It used British-designed and built reactors, which it went on ordering into the late 1970s, essentially until, with one exception, no more reactors were ordered. British nuclear energy was more expensive than British coal-generated energy. And the British were unable, as they'd hoped, to sell nuclear reactors overseas. The United States dominated. What then about France? As we know, the great civil nuclear power of the recent past. The French, of course, also had a national design and production program. But unlike the British, dropped it and adopted US designs. So what I'm suggesting here is actually the British, this is not a common idea, that the British after World War II were more nationalistic and obsessed with sovereignty than were the French. But there are some little differences. Nuclear weapons provide a key example. The United Kingdom developed its own national atomic bomb and hydrogen bomb and delivery programs in the 1940s and 1950s. But in the late 1950s, the United Kingdom gave up both the independent design of hydrogen bombs, adopting US ones, and gave up the ability to design and to produce important delivery systems. It even adopted US nuclear reactors for submarines. So the British independent deterrent was in fact not British and not independent. It was interdependent. Now this is actually a very interesting phenomenon. We have here what is argued to be the absolute core of national sovereignty. Why would you argue for national sovereignty in civil airplanes or in electronics if you'd given up national sovereignty in atomic weapons? That's exactly the position the United Kingdom got into. Now, why do the British have this interdependent nuclear system? Well, one answer given by some serious British people, analysts, is because the French have them. Indeed, I've heard it suggested that, the British systems are, of course, much better than the French systems. But that, of course, is because they're not British at all. They are American. And the French have made the choice, I assume, to go for full and real nuclear independence. It has costs. There's no claim, I imagine, that this is the best nuclear system in the world, but it is French, and it does serve very particular national objectives. It's the result of a conscious choice, and that's important. Some final thoughts. What strikes me about these issues is how central an image of sovereignty is rather than the reality. Yeah. How if one breaks it down into different elements, some bits seem to matter more than others, and the search for sovereignty continues even though a nation will be very obviously vulnerable in ways that are not covered by the rhetoric. Why make your own nuclear weapons if you can't deliver them independently? Why have your own aircraft industry when you could buy aircraft from the United States just as you buy nuclear weapons? The whole argument begins to unravel. But of course, that doesn't mean it is not powerful. I've been talking about the past, in fact, a rather distant past. Let me just say some things to finish about the position in the United Kingdom today. After all, the United Kingdom embraced globalization particularly wholeheartedly, rejected the notion that national ownership mattered, that national production of what were taken to be important elements mattered either. It has no nationally owned car production, for example, no national train maker, and indeed it is missing all sorts of national industrial sectors. Now, I've argued, actually, that the vote behind Brexit was a vote of aged economic nationalists who were rejecting this program of globalization and economic internationalism. But the paradox, the irony, perhaps, is that the Brexiters themselves did not promise economic nationalism, but on the contrary, promised a radicalized economic liberalism, a very strongly radicalized economic liberalism. Nevertheless, in this context, a new nationalistic fervor has appeared in the United Kingdom, often idiotic. For example, very strong claims for a specific national success in COVID vaccines, with the added entirely false claim that this was only possible because the UK was in the process of leaving the European Union. Utterly, utterly false, but repeated by at least 4 prime ministers that we've had in this era. But there are people who believe that the UK did have a particular success with the COVID vaccines, with the AstraZeneca in particular. It is not widely noted, if at all, that the United Kingdom was a net importer of COVID vaccines. A net importer from the EU, yeah, and a net importer from the United States. It barely exported any vaccine at all. So it's not a success in that sense. There is a British vaccine, but it was not the one the British people chose to use or British government chose to give to British people. Another example, the UK was, we are told by the left and the right, a pioneer in offshore wind. The equipment all comes from outside the country. There is a claim for national brilliance in science. We are told we are a science superpower. that we have the potential to dominate the world of the fourth industrial revolution as we dominated the world of the first industrial revolution. It sounds idiotic saying it in France, yeah. But believe me, this is what is said in the United Kingdom. The idea that with 2% of world R&D you could control the future is obviously ridiculous, and yet informs, is the core idea behind British industrial strategy to the extent that it exists. And more than that, there is an insistence that it is the R&D only that matters, that new industries will be created. So we've had a great emphasis on British leadership in battery technology. Now, there is no British battery manufacturer. There is, in fact, very little battery manufacture in the United Kingdom at all. Yet that rhetoric of leadership is very much there. So the focus of attention is almost exclusively on the supposed capacity to innovate, but in fact, the capacity to research in what are taken to be key areas. No interest in the capacity to do any of the rest. No interest in control or ownership either. So what are the lessons from history? Well, things change a lot. And I think the most important point is the place of France and the United Kingdom in the world today is radically different from that of 1900 or even of 1960s. But I think a historical treatment can perhaps help us capture what is at issue and perhaps how to think realistically about these issues. And in particular, I think about the dangers of the crude nationalist thinking that have characterized debates in this area. And to understand in particular that making claims for national sovereignty doesn't actually mean acquiring national sovereignty. Let me end with a question that I used to ask my undergraduate students. Imagine that in 1945, the United Kingdom had in fact become the 51st state of the United States. You can joke that in fact it did, but let's imagine it really had happened. And imagine, furthermore, that Washington decided that no research or development would be conducted in the United Kingdom, perhaps on the grounds it was too close to the Soviet Union, who knows? And that there would be no development of any kind of British technology. That's a scenario. The question is, would the United Kingdom have been richer or poorer as a result of that policy? Now, I think it's probably easier to make the argument that it would have been richer. That's to say, it would have equalized GDP per capita with the other 50, the average of the other 50 states. Plausible argument. But it could be argued another way. But the point is this, that the United Kingdom was making choices. Choices perhaps to impoverish itself by having its own low-quality aeroplanes and all the rest of it. And that's what we need to focus on, that there is actually a choice here and always has been. Thank you very much.